Hello and welcome to my YouTube channel. Tonight, imagine this. The sun has vanished behind frozen fields. The wind howls through wooden walls. There is no electricity. No heater. No warm bed waiting for you. Only darkness, cold, and a long medieval night. For medieval peasants, surviving winter was not about comfort. It was about endurance. Tonight, we step back into the Middle Ages to uncover how ordinary peasants survived the coldest nights in history, using nothing but fire, fabric, food, and quiet resilience. From roughly the 9th century to the early 14th century, Europe experienced periods of extreme cold, especially during what historians later called the Little Ice Age. This was not a single winter, but generations of colder weather. Summers were shorter. Winters arrived early and stayed late. Snow covered villages for months at a time. Rivers froze solid enough for people to walk across them. Crops failed more often. Animals died. Hunger became a constant companion. For medieval peasants, winter was not a season, it was a test of survival. Who were the peasants? Peasants made up nearly 90% of the medieval population. They were farmers, laborers, shepherds, and villagers who lived close to the land. Their lives depended entirely on the weather. When winter came, the fields fell silent. There was no planting, no harvesting, no income. What they had stored from summer and autumn had to last until spring. And often it didn't. A harsh winter could mean starvation. A long winter could mean death. Yet peasants had no choice but to endure. Wind faced the cold that never left. Cold in the medieval world was not something you escaped indoors. Cold lived inside the home. Walls were thin. Gaps allowed wind to creep in. Roofs leaked heat. Floors were bare earth, damp and freezing. At night, temperatures inside peasant homes were often barely warmer than outside. There were no thermometers, but historians believe indoor winter temperatures often hovered just above freezing. Every breath was visible. Every movement stiffened the body. Children cried from the cold. Elderly bodies struggled. Illness spread easily in such conditions. Darkness and fear. Winter nights were incredibly long. Without artificial lighting, darkness arrived early, sometimes by mid-afternoon. Candles were expensive and used sparingly. Most homes relied on firelight alone. Once the fire dimmed, shadows filled the room. Outside, wolves howled. Wind battered wooden walls. Snow creaked under unseen footsteps. For many peasants, winter nights brought fear of sickness, fear of hunger, fear that morning might never come. And yet they slept. They had to. Ice cubed winter as a killer. Cold itself was deadly. Hypothermia was common, though unnamed. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes. Respiratory illnesses spread rapidly in smoky, unventilated homes. Weak bodies, especially children and the elderly, were the first to fall. Medieval records speak quietly of winter deaths, but archaeology tells the fuller story: shortened lifespans, malnutrition, fragile bones. Still, peasants endured. Fire, why survival mattered more than comfort. Comfort did not exist as a goal. Survival was everything. Every decision in winter revolved around one question. How do we last until spring? Food was rationed. Fires were controlled. Movement was limited. Energy was conserved. Peasants adapted not because life was easy, but because nature demanded it. They learned to live with cold instead of fighting it. A night begins. As the sun set behind frozen fields, families gathered indoors. Doors were shut tight. Shutters closed. Fires reduced to glowing embers. Night began. Outside, the world froze. Inside, peasants prepared to endure another long, silent stretch of darkness, knowing that survival depended on what they had built, stored, and learned over generations. And this is where their real ingenuity begins. Now that we understand how unforgiving medieval winters truly were, it's time to step inside the place where peasants spent their coldest nights. Their homes. These were not houses of comfort or beauty. They were shelters built for survival. And on a winter night, every wall, every crack, Every ember of fire mattered. Derelict house, a simple shelter against a frozen world. A medieval peasant's home was small, humble, and built using whatever materials were available nearby. Most houses were constructed from wooden frames, filled with a mixture of mud, straw, clay, and animal dung, a method known as wattle and daub. This combination was cheap, easy to repair, and provided some insulation against the cold. Roofs were thickly thatched with straw or reeds. While they did little to keep out extreme cold, they were better than bare wood or stone and helped trap what little warmth the house could hold. Floors were not wooden. They were packed earth, cold, damp, and hard. In winter, this earth floor often froze. To help, families scattered straw, rushes, or dried leaves across the ground. Over time, these layers mixed with dirt and ash, forming a rough insulation underfoot. It was far from clean, but it helped. Doors, windows, and the battle against wind. Wind was one of the greatest enemies of medieval homes. Doors were made of thick wood, often poorly fitted. Gaps were common. To block drafts, peasants stuffed cloth, straw, or animal skins into cracks. Windows, if they existed at all, had no glass. Glass was rare and expensive. Instead, windows were covered with wooden shutters or thin animal skins stretched tightly across openings. At night, everything was sealed. Shutters closed. Doors barred. Any opening that allowed wind inside was blocked as best as possible. Still, cold air always found a way in. The hearth, heart of the home. At the center of every peasant home was the hearth. This open fire was built directly on the floor, a simple circle of stones or packed clay where wood burned slowly. The hearth was everything. It provided warmth, light, a place to cook food, a sense of safety. There were no chimneys in many early medieval homes. Smoke rose upward and escaped through holes in the roof or through the door when it was opened. As a result, the air inside was thick with smoke. Eyes burned. Lungs ached. Walls blackened with soot. But smoke had an unexpected benefit. It helped keep insects away and slightly preserved wooden beams. And most importantly, the fire kept people alive. Heat that never reached the corners. Despite the hearth, medieval homes were never truly warm. Heat stayed close to the fire. A few steps away, the air turned icy again. At night, families arranged themselves strategically, sleeping as close to the hearth as possible without risking burns. Children were placed nearest the fire. Elderly family members followed. Those strongest against cold slept farthest away. Warmth was rationed, just like food. One room, many lives. Most peasant homes had only one room. In that single space, families cooked, ate, worked, prayed, slept, and survived. There were no separate bedrooms. No privacy. No silence. During the day, the room bustled with activity. At night, it transformed into a sleeping space. Simple wooden benches doubled as beds. Some families owned rough wooden bed frames with straw-filled mattresses. Others slept directly on the floor. Everything happened in that one room, and in winter, no one wanted to leave it. Animals indoors, warmth over comfort. One detail often surprises modern listeners. During winter, animals were sometimes brought inside the home. Chickens, goats, sheep, and even pigs might share the same space as humans. This was not done out of affection. It was done for warmth. Animals gave off body heat. Their presence raised the temperature slightly, just enough to matter during freezing nights. They were often kept near the walls or close to the hearth, separated by low wooden barriers. It was noisy. It smelled strongly. But it worked. In medieval winter, comfort meant nothing. Survival meant everything. Candle light in the darkness. Winter nights were long and dark. Candles were made from animal fat or beeswax, and they were expensive. Most peasants used them sparingly. The primary source of light was the fire itself. As flames danced and shadows flickered across soot-stained walls, families finished their evening tasks quickly. Once darkness fully settled, there was little to do but sleep. Night was not a time for activity. It was a time to conserve energy. Preparing the space for sleep. As night approached, the home slowly changed. Cooking pots were moved aside. Tools were stacked against the walls. Bedding was laid out near the hearth. Straw mattresses were shaken and reshaped. Blankets were layered thickly. Cloaks and spare clothing were added on top for extra warmth. Nothing was wasted. Every scrap of fabric mattered. Before sleeping, the fire was carefully reduced. Large flames were dangerous. Instead, glowing embers were buried under ash to keep heat alive through the night. If the fire went out completely, restarting it in the morning could be difficult, especially if flint was lost or damp. Sleeping through the cold. Sleep came early. Exhaustion helped. After long days of physical labor, peasants fell asleep quickly, even in discomfort. They slept lightly, often waking during the night to tend the fire, shift closer to warmth, or check on children. Winter sleep was not deep or peaceful. It was survival sleep. Every night endured was a victory. Wind faced sounds of the medieval night. As families slept, the world outside remained alive. Wind rattled shutters. Snow slid from rooftops. Wolves howled in distant forests. Inside, the home creaked as wood contracted in the cold. The fire crackled softly. Breathing slowed. In these moments, the peasant home became a fragile island of warmth in a frozen world. Candle transitioned to Section 3. The home offered some protection, but it was never enough on its own. To truly survive the coldest nights, medieval peasants relied on what they wore, what they slept on, and how closely they stayed together. In the next section, we'll explore clothing, bedding, and the quiet power of shared warmth, the human strategies that turned suffering into endurance. By the time night settled over a medieval village, the fire alone was never enough. Flames faded. Embers cooled. And cold always returned. To survive the coldest nights, medieval peasants relied on something just as important as fire: what they wore, what they slept on, and who they slept beside. Warmth, in the Middle Ages, was layered. It was shared. And it was carefully preserved. Coat clothing as the first line of defense. Medieval peasants owned very little clothing, but what they had was designed for survival. The most important material was wool. Wool was heavy, thick, and uncomfortable by modern standards, but it had one vital advantage: it trapped heat even when damp. In a cold, smoky home, this quality made wool priceless. Peasants wore long wool tunics that reached below the knees. Over these, they layered cloaks, shawls, or sleeveless outer garments. Stockings covered the legs, while hoods wrapped tightly around the head and neck. During winter nights, clothes were not removed. Sleeping fully dressed was normal. Removing layers meant losing warmth, and warmth could mean life or death. Some peasants even slept wearing their working clothes, only loosening belts or boots if conditions allowed. Repairs, patches, and inherited clothing. New clothing was rare. Most garments were passed down through families for generations. They were repaired again and again with patches, stitches, and careful mending. A patched cloak was not a sign of poverty, it was a sign of survival. Every tear was closed. Every hole was sealed. Even small gaps could allow cold air to creep in during the night. Winter clothing was treated with care, dried by the fire, and never wasted. Bedding made from the land. Beds in medieval peasant homes were simple. If a family was fortunate, they owned a rough wooden bed frame raised slightly off the ground. Many slept directly on the floor. Mattresses were sacks filled with straw, hay, dried leaves, or reeds. These materials trapped air, providing basic insulation. Over time, bedding flattened and had to be refilled. Straw was replaced regularly, especially before winter. Blankets were thick and heavy, usually made from wool. Animal skins were also common, especially in colder regions. Weight mattered. Heavy blankets trapped warmth better than light ones. Basket layering the night. At night, bedding was carefully layered. First came the straw mattress. Then a cloth sheet or rough fabric. Then wool blankets. Then cloaks, spare tunics, or animal skins. Nothing was wasted. Even sacks, rags, and old clothing were placed on top to block cold air. Peasants understood something modern science later confirmed: layers trap heat. The power of shared sleep. Perhaps the most important survival strategy of all was sleeping together. Beds were shared, not by choice, but by necessity. Parents slept beside children. Siblings shared blankets. Grandparents were placed near the center, where warmth was greatest. Privacy did not exist. Warmth mattered more. Body heat raised the temperature of the bed space significantly. One person alone lost heat quickly. Several together stayed warmer far longer. This practice saved lives, especially during the coldest nights. Goat animals as living heaters. In extreme cold, peasants sometimes shared sleeping space with animals. Goats, sheep, chickens, and even pigs were brought indoors at night. Animals produced heat constantly. Their presence warmed the room and reduced heat loss. They were usually kept near walls or close to sleeping areas, separated by simple barriers. This arrangement was not comfortable. It was loud. It smelled strongly. But it worked. Warmth mattered more than cleanliness. Knowledge passed through generations. Peasants did not understand heat scientifically, but they understood it practically. Through generations of trial and error, they learned how many layers to wear, how to position bedding, where to place the weakest family members, when to bring animals inside, how to seal drafts using cloth or straw. This knowledge was passed quietly from parent to child. It was never written down. It was lived. Sleeping in shifts. Winter sleep was often broken. Some families slept in shifts, especially during extreme cold. One person stayed awake to tend the fire while others slept. Later they switched. This ensured embers stayed alive and warmth remained in the room. Sleep was not about rest, it was about endurance. Candle illness and cold nights. Despite all efforts, cold still caused illness. Coughs lingered. Lungs weakened. Joints stiffened. But warmth reduced the risk. Children wrapped tightly in shared bedding survived more often than those left alone. The elderly, placed at the center of warmth, lived longer than those pushed to the edges. These small choices mattered. The quiet of the night. As bodies settled into shared warmth, the home grew still. The fire glowed faintly. Breath slowed. Wind pressed against walls. In these moments, warmth was not just physical, it was emotional. Families survived winter nights together. Candle transitioned to Section 4. Clothing, bedding, and shared warmth helped peasants endure the cold, but they could not survive without firewood, food, and daily preparation. In the next section, we'll explore how peasants gathered fuel, rationed food, and carefully prepared each night, knowing that a single mistake could cost them everything. The quiet of the night. As bodies settled into shared warmth, the home grew still. The fire glowed faintly. Breath slowed. Wind pressed against walls. In these moments, warmth was not just physical, it was emotional. Families survived winter nights together. Candle transitioned to Section 4. Clothing, bedding, and shared warmth helped peasants endure the cold, but they could not survive without firewood, food, and daily preparation. In the next section, we'll explore how peasants gathered fuel, rationed food, and carefully prepared each night, knowing that a single mistake could cost them everything. By winter, medieval peasants knew one simple truth. Cold could be endured, but only with preparation. Firewood, food, and daily routine were the invisible shields that stood between life and death during the coldest nights. Nothing was left to chance. Firewood, winter's most precious resource. Firewood was not just fuel. It was survival. Without fire, there was no warmth, no light, and no cooked food. During winter, firewood became more valuable than almost anything else a peasant owned. Peasants spent much of late summer and autumn gathering wood. Families collected fallen branches, dead trees, and dried brush from nearby forests or common lands. This work was hard and dangerous. Axes were heavy. Hands numbed quickly. Injuries were common. Yet firewood piles had to be large, because winter was long. Every log gathered in autumn was a promise of warmth months later. Rationing the flames. Once winter arrived, firewood was carefully rationed. Fires were never allowed to burn wildly. Large flames consumed fuel too quickly and risked setting thatched roofs ablaze. Instead, peasants kept low, steady fires. At night, flames were reduced to glowing embers. These embers were covered with ash, a technique known as banking the fire. Ash slowed the burn, preserved heat, and allowed the fire to be restarted in the morning. If a fire went out completely, restarting it could take hours, or fail entirely if flint was lost or damp. A dead fire in winter was a serious danger. Fire as light and comfort. Fire provided the only reliable light during winter nights. Candles were rare and expensive. Most peasants relied entirely on firelight. This meant night activities were limited. Once darkness fell, work stopped. People sat close to the hearth, spoke quietly, repaired tools, mended clothing, or simply rested. Night was not meant for productivity. It was meant for survival. Food that fought the cold. Food played a powerful role in surviving winter nights. Cold bodies needed energy, and peasants understood this instinctively. Evening meals were the largest of the day. Thick stews simmered slowly over the hearth, made from beans, lentils, grains, root vegetables, and occasionally salted meat. These meals were heavy and filling. They digested slowly, helping bodies produce warmth through the night. Bread and porridge were staples. Ale was common, safer than water and rich in calories. Winter food was simple, but it kept people alive. Salt preservation, eating the past to survive the present. Fresh food was rare in winter. Peasants survived on what they preserved months earlier. Meat was salted, dried, or smoked. Vegetables were pickled or stored in cool cellars. Grain was kept dry and protected from rodents. Nothing was wasted. Every bite mattered. Families measured their food carefully, knowing spring was far away. Mantelpiece clocked the rhythm of winter days. Winter days followed a slow, careful rhythm. People woke late, conserving energy. Daylight hours were used wisely, repairing homes, tending animals, gathering small amounts of fuel. As evening approached, everything turned toward preparation for night. Cracks in walls were sealed with mud or straw. Shutters were closed tightly. Bedding was laid out. Cooking was finished before full darkness. Night was faced calmly, but seriously. Conserving energy. Peasants understood that warmth came from within as well as from fire. Unnecessary movement wasted energy. Sweating during winter was dangerous, as damp clothing led to cold. People moved slowly. They rested often. During extreme cold, work was reduced to the bare minimum. Survival meant knowing when not to act. When the cold was too strong. Some winters were worse than others. During extreme cold snaps, entire families stayed indoors for days. Fires burned constantly. Food was rationed carefully. Animals were kept close. Villages became silent. In these moments, peasants relied on experience, not hope. They waited. Candles, small rituals of comfort. Despite hardship, peasants found small comforts. Warm food. Shared stories. Quiet prayers by the fire. These moments mattered. They helped people endure nights that felt endless. Crescent moon, the night settles in. As darkness deepened, fires dimmed to embers. Families gathered close. Bedding was layered thickly. Outside, frost-covered fields. Wind moved through bare trees. Inside, warmth held, just enough. Another night began. Candle transitioned to Section 5. Firewood, food, and preparation carried peasants through the night, but something deeper held them together. In the final section, we'll explore community, faith, and quiet endurance, the unseen forces that helped medieval peasants survive winter when nothing else could. As the coldest nights stretched on, medieval peasants depended on more than fire, food, and shelter. What truly carried them through winter was something quieter, something invisible. Community. Faith. Endurance. These were the final defenses against the cold. Houses life lived together. Medieval villages were small, close-knit communities. People lived near one another not by choice, but by necessity. Survival in winter was nearly impossible alone. When one family struggled, others noticed. Firewood was shared. Food was divided. Warmth was offered. A neighbor might take in a child for the night if a home grew too cold. An elderly villager might sleep near another hearth when their own fire failed. These acts were not charity. They were survival strategies. Because winter spared no one. Handshake mutual dependence. Peasants understood a simple truth. Today it may be you who gives. Tomorrow it may be you who needs. Villages functioned as living systems. If one part failed, the whole community suffered. This mutual dependence created quiet bonds of trust, forged not in comfort, but in shared hardship. Winter strengthened these bonds. Faith in the darkness. Faith played a powerful role during medieval winters. Many peasants believed winter was a test, sent by God, nature, or fate. Prayer offered comfort when warmth could not. Candles were lit in churches even when homes were dark. Bells rang across frozen fields, reminding villagers they were not alone. Faith did not warm the body, but it warmed the spirit. And sometimes, that was enough to endure another night. Milky Way long nights and silent waiting. Winter nights were long, painfully long. With little light and no distractions, peasants slept early and often woke during the night. There was much waiting. Waiting for dawn. Waiting for spring. Waiting for cold to loosen its grip. Time moved slowly in winter. Each night survived was counted quietly, one by one. Mental strength over comfort. Medieval peasants did not expect comfort. They expected hardship. This mindset mattered. By accepting cold as part of life, they focused on endurance rather than resistance. They learned to remain calm, to conserve energy, to endure discomfort without panic. This mental strength saved lives. Seedling hope beyond winter. Despite suffering, peasants believed winter would end. Spring always came, eventually. Seeds waited beneath frozen soil. Animals survived to breed again. Fields rested before renewal. This belief in return, in warmth, light, and life, carried people through the darkest nights. Hope did not erase hunger or cold. But it gave meaning to endurance. Candled the final night. As winter deepened, fires burned lower. Food stores grew thin. Yet families continued to gather close, night after night. Children slept beside parents. Elders rested near warmth. Outside, snow covered the land. Inside, life endured. Crescent moon closing, a sleep-friendly ending. As the medieval night fades into silence, we remember the quiet strength of those who lived before us. No heaters. No comfort. Only resilience. They survived not because life was easy, but because they endured together. Thank you for spending this quiet journey through history with me. Now rest. And let the night gently carry you into sleep.